Judge Carter, open the trunk. The words cut through the rain with the cold certainty of a verdict already decided. Judge Naomi Carter stood beside her dark sedan in the nearly empty courthouse parking garage, listening as water whispered against the concrete beyond the entrance. 6 stories above her, the building where she had spent years weighing evidence and protecting the meaning of due process glowed beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Now Officer Daniel Whitmore stood between her and the elevator, one hand resting near his badge, his expression carrying the quiet confidence of a man who believed the next few minutes belonged entirely to him. Naomi looked at him without moving. On what grounds? She asked. Whitmore's mouth tightened. We received information concerning missing evidence. Your vehicle matches the description we were given. Naomi glanced at the rows of parked cars. Something about his answer felt rehearsed. Too clean. Too immediate. And you believe that evidence is in my car? Open the trunk, ma'am. Ma'am. Not Judge Carter. He knew exactly who she was, yet he had deliberately stripped away the title. Naomi noticed that. She noticed everything. The security camera above the elevator. The patrol vehicle parked 30 feet away. The courthouse employee standing beneath an umbrella near the garage entrance, pretending not to watch. Most importantly, she noticed Whitmore had never asked where she had been during the previous hour. He already seemed certain of what he expected to find. Imagine standing in the place where you have spent years demanding that accusations be supported by facts, only to realize someone has decided that your own reputation can be destroyed before a single fact is examined. Naomi had learned long ago that anger could make people careless. Silence made them reveal themselves. She reached into her purse slowly, removed the key fob, and pressed the button. The trunk clicked. Whitmore stepped forward. He lifted it. Then everything became still. Beneath Naomi's courthouse file sat a clear evidence bag marked with an official property label. Whitmore stared at it for half a second before turning toward her. There it was. Satisfaction. Small. Almost invisible. But Naomi saw it. Well, he said quietly. Looks like we have a problem. Naomi did not answer. Her attention had moved to the evidence label. Case number. Property code. Date. Then the timestamp. Her expression changed, but only slightly. Whitmore apparently mistook that change for fear. Turn around, he ordered. Hands behind your back. Naomi complied without argument. A moment later, she heard the metallic click of the handcuffs closing around her wrists. Whitmore leaned closer, lowering his voice as though the rain itself might overhear him. Being a judge doesn't put you above the law. Naomi kept her eyes on the evidence bag. Something was wrong with that timestamp. Very wrong. And suddenly the humiliation, the accusation, even Whitmore's confidence became secondary to one chilling realization. Whoever had placed that evidence inside her trunk had planned this carefully. They had known her schedule. They had known her car. They had known exactly where she would be. But they had made one mistake. A tiny mistake printed in black ink on a white evidence label. Naomi slowly raised her eyes toward Whitmore. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. What? He asked. Naomi said nothing. Not yet. Because 6 hours earlier, inside that same courthouse, she had opened a confidential file bearing one name again and again. Officer Daniel Whitmore. 6 hours earlier, Naomi Carter had walked through the courthouse doors carrying nothing more unusual than a leather briefcase, a paper cup of coffee, and the quiet concentration of someone expecting a difficult day. Morning sunlight stretched across the stone steps outside, but inside, the building felt colder. Fluorescent lights hummed above polished floors. Attorneys moved quickly between courtrooms. Clerks balanced folders against their chests. Somewhere beyond the security checkpoint, a gavel struck wood, followed by the low murmur of another case beginning. Naomi had worked in this building long enough to recognize its rhythms, but that morning something felt different. People who normally greeted her held their conversations a little shorter. A records clerk looked toward her, then immediately lowered his eyes. Naomi noticed, filed the detail away, and kept walking. Her chambers were on the 4th floor, less than 100 feet from courtroom 14. When she entered, her judicial assistant, Rachel Monroe, had already placed the morning files across her desk. Most were ordinary matters. One was not. It was a thick, confidential folder marked for judicial review. Naomi set down her coffee and opened it. The first complaint described questionable evidence handling during an arrest. The second described a witness statement that had changed after an officer interview. The third involved a body camera that had supposedly malfunctioned during the exact period investigators needed to examine. Naomi turned another page. Then another. Different dates. Different citizens. Different circumstances. One name kept returning. Officer Daniel Whitmore. Naomi leaned back slowly. She had seen patterns disguised as coincidence before. A single inconsistency could be an error. Two could still have an innocent explanation. But when the same name appeared beside missing records, disputed timelines, and unresolved complaints, coincidence became harder to accept. Rachel entered carrying another document. This arrived from Internal Affairs 20 minutes ago, she said. Naomi accepted it. Who requested the transfer? That is the strange part. Nobody seems willing to say. Naomi looked toward the hallway through the open door. A uniformed officer passed without looking inside. Seal the working copy, Naomi said, and do not discuss this file with anyone outside chambers. Rachel nodded, but hesitated. Judge Carter, there is something else. She explained that someone had attempted to access the electronic docket before sunrise using credentials that did not belong to the assigned clerk. The attempt had failed, but the system had recorded it. Naomi felt the first quiet pull of concern. Not fear. Concern. Someone knew this review existed. She closed the folder and rested her hand on its cover. Across the courthouse, near the elevators, Daniel Whitmore stood speaking with another officer. He looked relaxed, almost bored, until Naomi stepped into the hallway. Their eyes met from nearly 60 feet apart. Whitmore stopped talking. Naomi did not. She walked toward courtroom 14 with the confidential file held against her side. As she passed him, neither spoke. Yet something in his expression stayed with her. It was not surprise at seeing a judge. It was recognition of a threat. Naomi continued toward the courtroom, unaware that before the afternoon ended, the evidence inside that folder would disappear, an anonymous call would be made, and the man watching her walk away would be waiting beside her car. Daniel Whitmore had spent 14 years learning exactly how far a badge could carry a man when everyone around him preferred convenience over questions. He was not the loudest officer in the department, nor the most decorated, but he understood something more useful than either distinction. Systems often protected routine, and Whitmore had become very good at making questionable decisions look routine. Complaints had followed him for years. A traffic stop with conflicting reports. Property entered into evidence without a clear chain of custody. A witness who insisted her statement had been rewritten after she left the station. Each incident seemed isolated when viewed alone. Each disappeared beneath paperwork, administrative delays, or explanations polished until uncertainty replaced accountability. Whitmore survived them all. Over time, survival became confidence, and confidence hardened into entitlement. By 9:30 that morning, he was sitting in a small courthouse conference room with Sergeant Thomas Keller, staring at a printed docket summary resting between them. Judge Naomi Carter's name appeared near the top. Whitmore read it twice. "She has the review?" he asked. Keller did not answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. Whitmore leaned back and looked toward the narrow window in the door. Naomi had already passed through the hallway once, carrying the confidential folder against her side. He knew what was inside. More importantly, he knew what could happen if she started connecting the cases instead of reviewing them separately. Naomi Carter had a reputation for patience. She did not chase headlines. She did not embarrass officers from the bench. She did something Whitmore found far more dangerous. She asked precise questions, and she remembered the answers. "It should never have reached her chambers," Whitmore said. Keller lowered his voice. "Then maybe you should have given Internal Affairs less to send upstairs." Whitmore's expression changed. For years, people had spoken around him carefully. Keller had just spoken directly. "Watch yourself," Whitmore replied. Keller stood. "That is exactly what I am doing." When the door closed, Whitmore remained seated. The courthouse continued moving beyond the glass as though nothing had changed. Phones rang. Elevator doors opened and closed. Shoes crossed polished tile. Yet for Whitmore, the morning had narrowed to one problem. Naomi Carter. He had seen how people responded to her authority, and resentment had been building long before that day. In his mind, she represented every question he believed he should never have to answer, every decision he believed outsiders had no right to examine. Her position offended the private hierarchy he carried inside himself, a hierarchy in which someone like Naomi was supposed to explain herself to men like him, not the other way around. At 10:17, Whitmore entered the records corridor. At 10:21, an electronic access request appeared under another employee's credentials. At 10:24, a courthouse camera captured him leaving the corridor alone. Those details meant nothing yet. Later, they would mean almost everything. Near noon, Naomi returned to her chambers and found Rachel Monroe standing beside the desk, unusually pale. "Judge Carter," Rachel said quietly. "Someone accessed the sealed file." Naomi stopped. The folder was still there. The pages looked untouched, but one evidence inventory sheet was missing. Naomi stared at the empty space where it had been clipped. Somewhere downstairs, Whitmore stepped into an elevator and checked his watch. For the first time that morning, he smiled. Naomi did not touch the folder. She stood beside her desk, studying the narrow gap where the missing inventory sheet had been clipped only hours earlier. Rachel Monroe watched her carefully, waiting for anger, alarm, anything that might explain what they were supposed to do next. Instead, Naomi asked, "Who entered these chambers after I left?" Rachel opened the access log on her computer. According to this, nobody. Naomi looked toward the closed door. Then the log is wrong. At 12:15, she requested that courthouse security preserve every hallway recording from that morning. At 12:22, she asked the clerk to secure the electronic access history. At 12:31, she received a quiet visit from Deputy Court Administrator Michael Reeves, a gray-haired man who had worked inside the building for almost 3 decades. He closed the door behind him and remained standing. "Naomi, I am going to tell you something I probably should not." She waited. "Let this review go." The room seemed suddenly quieter. "Why?" "Because this is not one officer with a few complaints." Reeves glanced toward the hallway before continuing. "People have been protecting people for a long time. Records disappear. Reports get corrected. Questions get redirected. You keep pulling this thread, you may discover it is attached to half the department." Naomi folded her hands on the desk. "That sounds like a reason to continue." Reeves sighed. "I knew you would say that." He left without another word. Naomi remained still for several seconds, then looked again at the confidential folder. The missing page contained the property number for evidence connected to one of Whitmore's disputed arrests. Someone had not taken a random sheet. Someone had selected exactly the page that could identify a specific evidence bag. At 1:48, Naomi left her chambers for a scheduled hearing. At 2:12, a courthouse employee carrying a maintenance cart entered the 4th-floor corridor. At 2:14, the camera outside Naomi's chambers briefly lost its signal. At 2:16, it returned. Nothing appeared unusual. That was what made it unusual. Across the building, Whitmore stood near the evidence room, speaking with a property clerk named Evan Brooks. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. Brooks looked nervous. Afterward, Whitmore did not. By 3:30, the courthouse had begun its slow afternoon transition. Attorneys gathered files. Visitors drifted toward the exits. Rain darkened the windows, turning the city beyond them into blurred gray shapes. Naomi finished her hearing and returned upstairs. Rachel handed her a note. Security called. They said one evidence item cannot be accounted for. Naomi read the property number. It matched the missing inventory sheet. She felt the pieces moving closer together. When was it reported missing? They are still confirming that. Naomi reached for her coat. Tell them to preserve everything. No exceptions. At 4:12, she walked toward the parking garage. At 4:16, an anonymous caller contacted courthouse security and claimed to have seen a woman place official evidence inside a dark sedan. At 4:18, the missing item was formally entered into the system as unaccounted for. At 4:20, Naomi stepped into the garage and saw Daniel Whitmore waiting beside her car. Rain echoed beyond the concrete walls. He already had another officer with him. Naomi slowed. Whitmore approached with professional calm that felt almost theatrical. "Judge Carter, we need to ask you a few questions." Naomi looked past him toward her sedan, then back at his face. "About what?" Whitmore paused just long enough to make the moment feel deliberate. "Missing evidence." Naomi said nothing. Above them, a security camera blinked steadily. Whitmore glanced at it once, then returned his attention to her. That single glance told Naomi something important. He was not afraid of being recorded. He believed the recording would help him. She reached into her purse for her keys, and somewhere behind Whitmore's calm expression, the trap was already closing. The trunk opened with a soft mechanical click, and for one suspended second, nobody spoke. Naomi Carter stared at the clear evidence bag resting beneath her courthouse files, while Daniel Whitmore stood several feet behind her, watching for the reaction he expected. Shock. Panic. An explanation offered too quickly. Naomi gave him none of those things. Her eyes moved instead to the white property label attached to the bag. The case number matched the confidential review. The property code matched the inventory sheet missing from her chambers. Then she saw the timestamp. 4:18 in the afternoon. Naomi heard Rachel's voice in her memory. Security had still been confirming when the evidence was officially reported missing. Whitmore stepped closer. That belongs to an active case. Naomi kept looking at the label. What time was it reported missing? She asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Only for a moment. 4:18. Naomi turned toward him. You are certain? That is what the report says. There it was. A simple answer. Calmly delivered. Completely wrong. Naomi had been inside the courthouse at 4:18, walking toward the garage after Rachel told her security had not yet finalized the missing property report. More importantly, the anonymous call had come 2 minutes earlier. Someone had claimed to see evidence being placed in Naomi's car before the system officially recorded that evidence as missing. How could an anonymous witness identify an item as stolen before courthouse personnel had completed the report? Naomi did not challenge Whitmore. Not yet. She had spent years watching people destroy their own credibility because silence made them uncomfortable. Whitmore was already beginning to fill that silence. Judge Carter, step away from the vehicle. She complied. The second officer remained near the patrol car, his expression increasingly uncertain. Whitmore removed the evidence bag without disturbing the files beneath it. Naomi noticed that too. He handled it with confidence, almost familiarity. You understand how serious this is, he said. Naomi looked directly at him. I understand exactly how serious it is. Whitmore interpreted the sentence as surrender. His shoulders relaxed. Minutes later, Naomi was escorted from the garage through the courthouse's main entrance instead of the secured side corridor normally used in sensitive situations. That choice was not accidental. People saw her. Clerks stopped walking. Attorneys lowered their phones, then raised them again. Visitors whispered as the judge they, recognized from courtroom 14, passed beneath the marble archway with her hands restrained behind her. Imagine spending years protecting the dignity of that building, only to be displayed inside it as though an accusation had already become a verdict. Naomi felt every stare, but she kept her head level. Whitmore walked beside her, letting the moment breathe, letting people watch. Near the elevators, he leaned slightly toward her. Nobody is going to believe you now. Naomi finally looked at him. His face carried the confidence she had seen from 60 feet away that morning, only stronger now. He believed reputation was evidence. He believed humiliation was proof. He believed that once people saw a black woman in handcuffs, some of them would decide what she was before hearing why she was there. Naomi's voice remained quiet. I do not need everybody to believe me. Whitmore's smile faded slightly. I only need the truth. The elevator doors opened. Inside, a small security camera reflected both of them in its dark glass. Naomi stepped forward and saw something else in the reflection. Evan Brooks, the evidence clerk, stood across the lobby staring at Whitmore. His face had gone pale. When Naomi met his eyes, Brooks immediately looked away. Whitmore had noticed him too. And for the first time since opening the trunk, Daniel Whitmore no longer looked completely comfortable. The elevator rose in silence, carrying Naomi Carter back toward the same floors where she had spent years listening to other people explain the worst moments of their lives. Daniel Whitmore stood beside her, his confidence carefully restored, but Naomi had already seen the crack in it. Evan Brooks had looked frightened. More important, Whitmore had looked frightened that Brooks was looking at him. When the doors opened, several courthouse employees were waiting in the hallway. Conversations stopped immediately. Naomi recognized faces she had known for years. Yet now some watched her with uncertainty, as though the restraints around her wrists had somehow rewritten everything they knew about her. Whitmore seemed almost energized by their attention. Keep moving, he said. Naomi did. She understood what he wanted. This was not simply an investigation. It was theater. Every witness in that hallway became part of the story he hoped would spread before anyone examined the facts. Judge Carter caught with missing evidence. Judge Carter escorted through her own courthouse. Judge Carter under investigation. The accusation would travel faster than any correction ever could. Near courtroom 14, Rachel Monroe stepped into the hallway and froze. Judge Carter. Whitmore immediately raised his voice. Please remain back, ma'am. Rachel stared at Naomi, horrified. Naomi gave her one small look, the same controlled expression she used from the bench when she wanted someone to listen carefully. Rachel understood. Do not argue. Observe. Remember. Naomi was taken into a private conference room normally reserved for attorneys. Whitmore closed the door and placed a printed report on the table. The evidence was reported missing at 4:18, he said again. Naomi studied the page without touching it. Who prepared this? Property Division. Who received the anonymous call? Security. And when? Whitmore paused. Around 4:16. Naomi lifted her eyes. There it was again. The impossible sequence. The caller had identified missing evidence 2 minutes before the official report said anyone knew it was missing. Whitmore attempted to move on, but Naomi was no longer listening to his performance. Her mind returned to the morning. 10:17. The records corridor. 10:21. Unauthorized electronic access. 10:24. Whitmore leaving the area. Then the camera failure outside her chambers at 2:14. Then Evan Brooks speaking with Whitmore near the evidence room. Separate details were beginning to form a single line. I want the chain of custody preserved, Naomi said. Whitmore gave a short laugh. You are not running this investigation. No, Naomi replied. But somebody will. His expression hardened. You really think your title makes this disappear? Naomi leaned back. My title has nothing to do with it. That answer bothered him more than anger would have. He had expected her to invoke authority, demand special treatment, perhaps threaten careers. Instead, she was doing what she always did. Asking questions. Remembering answers. Outside the room, footsteps approached quickly. The door opened and Sergeant Thomas Keller entered with Rachel behind him. Keller held a tablet in his hand. His face was serious. Officer Whitmore, we have a problem. Whitmore stood. What problem? Keller looked first at Naomi, then at him. Security preserved the garage footage. Whitmore said nothing. Keller continued. And the camera covering Judge Carter's parking row never lost its signal. For the first time, Naomi saw genuine uncertainty cross Whitmore's face. He recovered quickly. Good. Then it will show her putting the evidence there. Keller's eyes remained fixed on him. Maybe. A heavy silence settled over the room. But that is not the only footage we found. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Naomi watched him carefully. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. Because truth had not won yet. But somewhere inside the courthouse, a clock had started running backward through Daniel Whitmore's story, and every minute it recovered was bringing them closer to the 1 minute he had forgotten. Keller placed the tablet on the table, but he did not turn the screen toward Whitmore. Not yet. Before we watch anything, he said, I need you to confirm your timeline. Whitmore looked irritated. I already gave it. Give it again. The room became still. Naomi Carter sat quietly, while Rachel Monroe remained near the door, watching every face. Whitmore exhaled. The evidence was reported missing at 4:18. Security received the tip around 4:16. I located Judge Carter in the garage shortly afterward, searched the vehicle, and recovered the property. Keller nodded. And before 4:16, I was handling courthouse security matters. Where? Whitmore hesitated. Around the building. Naomi heard the weakness immediately. Around the building was not a location. It was an escape route disguised as an answer. Keller finally turned the tablet around. The first recording showed Naomi leaving the 4th floor at 4:12. The second showed her entering an elevator alone. The third showed her reaching the parking level minutes later. Nothing unexpected. Then Keller opened another file. The timestamp read 3:57. A service corridor appeared on the screen. Evan Brooks entered carrying a sealed property container. 30 seconds later, Whitmore appeared from the opposite direction. The two men spoke briefly before disappearing beyond the camera's view. Whitmore shook his head. That proves nothing. Keller did not respond. He advanced the recording. At 4:03, Brooks returned alone. He was no longer carrying the container. Naomi watched Whitmore carefully. His face remained controlled, but his eyes had changed. Where did you go after speaking with Brooks? Keller asked. I do not remember. Then maybe your access card does. Keller opened another record. Whitmore's courthouse credential had been used at the parking garage service entrance at 4:04. Naomi felt the entire timeline lock into place. The anonymous call came 12 minutes later. The missing evidence was officially recorded 2 minutes after that. But there was still one question. Who had placed it in her car? Keller played the garage footage. At 4:05, Naomi's sedan sat alone beneath the overhead lights. A figure entered the camera frame from the service entrance and approached the driver's side. Whitmore leaned forward. The angle did not show a face clearly. For a second, relief returned to him. Then Keller changed cameras. A second view showed the same figure crossing behind a concrete support column. This angle was clearer. The uniform, the courthouse credential, the unmistakable profile. Daniel Whitmore. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any accusation. Whitmore stared at the screen. That could be anybody. Keller looked at him. Then we have another problem. He enlarged the image. A small white marking was visible on the shoulder of the uniform. Whitmore had received that temporary identification patch earlier that morning after reporting damage to his regular insignia. Only one officer in the courthouse wore it that day. Him. Naomi finally spoke. 4:05. Whitmore turned toward her. She continued calmly. You entered the garage. Before the evidence was reported missing, before the anonymous call, and before you claimed to know anything about my vehicle. His mouth opened, but no answer came. Naomi remembered the label in her trunk. 4:18. The tiny mistake. The timestamp that had bothered her from the beginning. Whitmore had built his story around the official report time, but the cameras had preserved what his story could not explain. Keller reached for his phone. I am contacting Internal Affairs. Whitmore stood abruptly. You are making a mistake. Maybe, Keller said. That is why we investigate. Naomi watched the man who had walked beside her through the courthouse as though the outcome had already been decided. Now his certainty was disappearing one fact at a time. But then Rachel stepped forward. There is something else. Everyone looked at her. She held up a printed access record from Naomi's chambers. The missing inventory sheet was opened electronically this morning. Keller took the page. His expression changed. Naomi saw it immediately. Whose credentials? She asked. Rachel looked directly at Whitmore. Not his. The room went silent again. Because in that moment, Naomi understood the truth was larger than Daniel Whitmore, and somewhere inside the courthouse, someone else had helped him build the trap. Naomi looked at the access record in Rachel Monroe's hand and felt the shape of the case change. Until that moment, Daniel Whitmore had been the center of everything. Now he looked more like the visible end of something buried deeper. Sergeant Thomas Keller read the name attached to the electronic access and frowned. Evan Brooks. Whitmore immediately spoke. There. You have your answer. Naomi turned toward him. No. We have another question. Keller contacted courthouse security and asked them to locate Brooks. Less than 10 minutes later, the evidence clerk entered the conference room, looking as though he had spent those minutes deciding whether silence was still worth protecting. He stopped when he saw Whitmore. Naomi noticed it immediately. Mr. Brooks, Keller said, your credentials access Judge Carter's sealed inventory this morning. Brooks. Swallowed. I did not access it. The system says you did. Then someone used my credentials. Whitmore gave a dismissive laugh. Convenient. Brooks finally looked at him. Something changed in his face. Fear remained, but beneath it was exhaustion. You told me nobody would get hurt. The room went silent. Whitmore's expression hardened. I have no idea what you were talking about. Brooks looked toward Naomi. He said it was an internal test. He said Judge Carter was interfering with an active police investigation and they needed to know what documents she had. Naomi remained still. Who is they? Brooks hesitated. I do not know. Officer Whitmore never gave me names. Whitmore stepped into the conversation. This man is trying to save himself. Keller raised a hand. Let him finish. Brooks explained that Whitmore had asked him to retrieve a property container shortly before 4 o'clock, claiming it was being transferred for verification. Brooks had questioned the request because no transfer order existed. Whitmore told him the paperwork would follow. Then came the detail that changed everything. I never gave him my courthouse password, Brooks said. But this morning my access card disappeared for about 20 minutes. I found it later on my desk. Rachel looked at Naomi. The unauthorized docket attempt had occurred during that same window. Naomi's thoughts returned to the records corridor, the camera interruption outside her chambers, the missing inventory sheet, and Whitmore's unexplained movements. This was no longer simply an attempt to place evidence in her vehicle. Someone had been testing doors before the trap was set. Keller contacted Internal Affairs again, this time requesting an independent investigative team and preservation of every digital record connected to the courthouse review. Whitmore stared at him. "You are suspending me over the word of a clerk." "No," Keller replied. "I am removing you from duty while evidence is examined." The distinction landed heavily. Whitmore reached toward his badge, then stopped. For years, that piece of metal had represented certainty, access, authority, protection. Now Keller asked him to place it on the table. Naomi watched without satisfaction. Revenge would have been easy to understand, but this moment was larger than revenge. She had been publicly treated as though suspicion erased dignity. If she now used her position to demand an outcome, she would only replace one abuse of power with another. "I will give a statement as a witness," she said. Keller looked surprised. "Judge Carter, considering what happened, you could request direct involvement in the review." "No," her answer was immediate. "I was targeted. That means I do not decide his fate." Whitmore looked at her as if he could not understand why she was refusing the power he would have used without hesitation. Naomi continued, "Preserve the evidence. Follow the process. Let the facts speak." Keller nodded. Rachel quietly removed the restraints from Naomi's wrists after authorization came through. The room seemed different afterward, although nothing physical had changed. Same table, same fluorescent lights, same courthouse walls. Only the roles had shifted. Whitmore had entered believing Naomi's title could be turned against her. Instead, she had surrendered authority over the outcome and gained something more dangerous to him: credibility. As Internal Affairs investigators arrived downstairs, another discovery appeared in the preserved records. Whitmore's access card had not been the only credential used that morning. A second account had opened the confidential review before sunrise. It belonged to someone with administrative authority over the entire courthouse security system. Naomi read the name once, then again. She finally understood why Michael Reeves had warned her to stop pulling the thread. The name on the access record was Michael Reeves. Naomi Carter stared at it until the warning from earlier that day returned with an entirely different meaning. "Let this review go." At the time, she had heard concern in his voice. Now she wondered whether it had been fear. Internal Affairs arrived before sunset and sealed the relevant records, preserving security footage, access logs, property files, and courthouse communications. Naomi gave her statement exactly as she had promised, not as a judge demanding punishment, but as a witness describing facts. She explained the missing inventory sheet, Whitmore's timeline, the evidence bag in her trunk, and the timestamp that had exposed the contradiction. She added nothing she could not support. She needed no dramatic accusation. The records were already speaking. Reeves was questioned that evening. At first, he insisted that his account had been accessed without permission, but investigators found something harder to explain. His administrative credentials had disabled the camera outside Naomi's chambers at 2:14 and restored it 2 minutes later. Records also showed repeated access to complaint files involving Whitmore over several years. The pattern stretched far beyond one afternoon. Reports had been delayed. Reviews had been redirected. Complaints had quietly disappeared from active queues. Whitmore had not created the system protecting him. He had simply learned how comfortably he could live inside it. Evan Brooks agreed to cooperate fully. His testimony helped investigators reconstruct the movement of the evidence container. Keller turned over his own records. Rachel provided the preserved docket logs. One fact connected to another until the story Whitmore had built around Naomi collapsed under the weight of its own timestamps. Weeks later, the courthouse felt different when Naomi returned to courtroom 14. The investigation was still moving through proper legal channels, and she refused to comment publicly on outcomes that were not hers to decide. Whitmore remained off duty pending formal proceedings. Reeves had been removed from administrative responsibilities while investigators examined years of records. Several older complaints were reopened. For Naomi, that mattered more than seeing any single person fall. She had spent her career believing justice was not supposed to depend on whether the victim happened to be powerful enough to survive an accusation. What about the people who had no title? No chambers? No Rachel preserving logs, or Keller willing to question a fellow officer? That question stayed with her. On Monday morning, Naomi entered the courtroom wearing her black robe. Conversations softened as she approached the bench. Some people looked at her differently now, but she did not want admiration for enduring what should never have happened. She wanted the institution to remember what the incident had revealed. Before calling the first case, she looked at the empty courtroom floor where defendants, witnesses, officers, and ordinary citizens stood every day asking to be believed. Then she spoke. The law does not become more truthful because of the uniform worn by the person speaking, and it does not become less truthful because of the skin color of the person being accused. Evidence must answer to facts. Authority must answer to accountability. And every person who enters this courtroom must answer to the same standard. The room remained silent. Naomi lifted the gavel and brought it down once. The sound traveled through the courtroom, sharp and clean. Months later, people would remember the scandal, the missing evidence, and the officer who believed a badge could protect a lie. Naomi remembered something simpler. Daniel Whitmore had mistaken power for justice. Michael Reeves had mistaken silence for safety. Both had forgotten that truth requires neither permission nor rank to exist. Justice was never the badge. It was never the robe. It was what remained when the lies had nowhere left to hide.